It's extraordinary, really, taking on a classic like Swan Lake. I know I have quite a strong history with the company, and I've designed 4 or 5 shows for Matt, and we have a really good relationship, a really good rapport. I think the 3 of us, Matt, Les and myself. But Swan Lake's different, of course, because it's Swan Lake. It's that show that everybody knows and loves, and Matt was very keen to have fresh eyes on the show. But of course, I don't want to break something that people adore, and I didn't know it, and it was very important for me to start from as a new person to the show. That's strange in itself, because normally when you're making a new piece you go through a kind of period of developing ideas together. So much of the identity of the show is already in it, and there were things that Matt wanted to reinvent, but I didn't even know what was reinvented and what wasn't, because I didn't know the show. So I had to approach it as something completely new, completely fresh to me. I actually had to ignore its history. It's the only thing I can do, really. You know, we work through photographs and models, and we develop ideas, but as soon as I was in the room with those dancers, and I spent a couple of weeks with them, they're incredible, and you just want to tell their story and share that story, and that's the kind of most important thing to my work, is telling the story and bringing alive what I'm seeing in front of me. So actually the anxiety was all at the early stages, and once I was in rehearsal I was doing a new show. The lighting in Swan Lake, I mean, it's a slightly different show in many ways. If you've seen things like Red Shoes particularly, I suppose. Red Shoes, the space moves and it's very liquid, but quite often in a bigger space what the light does is focus us down. So it might say, oh, now the whole stage is what we're looking at, or we're just looking at a particular area. You're always doing that with lighting, sort of telling the audience what to look at and the kind of the feeling of the space that they're in. But with Swan Lake, the sort of boldness, the whiteness of the space in a way, you're not carving images from darkness, which is what you're doing with Red Shoes. You're kind of energizing a space and filling it with light. And it's interesting that one of the main stories in Swan Lake is about the oppression of the prince. And for me, the idea of him living in a white space is very, very exposing. So there's no hiding, there's no, and also there's no underbelly to his life. It's all very controlled and very formal, and the light, when you first are introduced to the world of the palace, it has that formality and that openness. There's no dark corners, really. It's all very exposed, quite brutal. What the prince is looking for, you feel, and you know this from the first image you see of the swan coming to him at night, coming to him in his dreams. You know, the swan is a character of darkness, a character of interest, of kind of intrigue, of all the things he can't have. So we go from this sort of austere white space to the kind of rich sort of moonlit, still light, but light in a kind of, I hope, a sort of beautiful, benign, sort of exciting, invigorating way when he goes eventually to the lake. I mean, it's also interesting when he goes to Soho, you know, the Swank bar, that's very, very dark. It's a nighttime scene, but also suddenly we're in a much darker, sort of seedier world. And while that's, you know, the darkness is frightening, but it also is very alluring. So again, lighting is kind of taking you through into dark spaces. And then, of course, you know, the sort of absolute pinnacle of his insanity, or his kind of tip into madness, is the asylum, and this kind of incredible stark white image which takes us into the world of his bedroom again, but starker than ever. But now the swans and his kind of, you know, the other life is coming into even that light space. So lighting is really important in the same way that Les' design is very important in terms of the mental state and the kind of the sense of a journey and a descent for the prince. I think I really love the bedroom in the last act, when the swan world starts to come into the world of the palace. I'm quite drawn to kind of brutal and beautiful images. It's something I really enjoy in my work. And, you know, with Matt, it's rare for me to have an opportunity to be quite so bold, but that moment I started off by making it quite dark, as if the kind of lake had come to the palace, and then Matt and Les were saying to me, no, actually it's really not that. It's like they physically come into the palace world, but they don't change. You know, the thing is, we're still in this kind of very austere, stark space, but they kind of break into that, and that's more terrifying in a way. Like a nightmare is more terrifying if you can see it in daylight, in a way, you know, if the really frightening things are just absolutely there and inescapable. I love the kind of bald flatness of that, and the way that the swans kind of appear from under the bed, and the fact that I've lit it quite hard so you can see everything really clearly, but you can see the corners of the room, you can see everything, and it feels really quite unsettling. Yeah, I love that moment. The best way to make any piece of theatre or opera or dance or anything is collaboration. It's all about communication. We are, any of us, only as good as the quality of the conversations we're having. And I think that's true of us as individuals in our conversation with the piece. I think it's between Matt and Les and myself. Sound is a slightly unusual one in this instance because it's more a relationship with the music than the sound design. So it's knowing the score and getting to know that, which was something new to me. Unlike when you make a piece of theatre and the sound design might be kind of quite a creative landscape of sounds and you're creating rhythm using that. Here that's all prescribed by Tchaikovsky. I also think it's interesting that those conversations between Les and Matt and myself, because it's really, that's the key conversation within Swan Lake, is choreographer, set and costume designer and me. That's where most of my ideas and kind of muscle comes from. I think the challenge for me when I'm working with Matthew on these shows is that he doesn't, in the same way that he's throwing so many conventions to do with dance away and sort of reinventing to tell stories, he's a storyteller. And I think that's why we kind of get on really well, is that I don't particularly, just by chance, I don't very often like dance. I'm much more a kind of drama and opera lighting designer. So the thing about Matt is he wants so much of the sort of idea of narrative of storytelling, even if people aren't speaking words, he wants them supported as if they were almost, but he wants the images to move as quickly as they do in dance. I sort of describe it sometimes, it's a bit like lighting Chekhov, but at a sort of 150 miles an hour. It's like every moment, nuance, detail needs to be able to be picked out, but you have to do that really quickly because people are moving, it's so much faster than most plays or operas would move. It's sort of bonkers because you're trying to work at the detail of drama and at the pace of dance. And also, it's rare to have a moment where you sort of step back and just let it be something that the audience can immerse themselves in. The thing that's different in Swan Lake, which I hadn't experienced before with Matt, is actually the second act of the first half is very much you give the space over to the swans, and it's sort of playing with the idea of that formality that the piece has from its sort of traditional roots. So in that section I do very little. I let them carry it because you also don't want to come between the audience and them. And in the same way that sort of physically they take the space over, I want the audience to kind of just absolutely be bowled over by that because they are incredible.